When I think about Tom Loosemore's definition of digital, the thing that most sticks out for me in that definition is you are having to think about people's raised expectations, because you are not in control of those expectations, and those expectations are not being set by you as an organisation, they're being set by what's going on outside.
Welcome to a brand new episode of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leadership, digital culture and change. I'm Zoe Amma.
And I'm Paul Thomas. Our podcast brings you interviews with leaders from the public, private and third sector who are using digital to navigate uncertainty and forge a path to the future.
In this episode, we speak to Laura Dewis, who is Chief Operating Officer at Full Fact, a charity of independent fact-checkers and campaigners who find, expose and counter the harm caused by bad information shared by anyone in public debate.
It really was a fascinating discussion, and one that I think will always be topical as long as social media platforms are out there holding our time and attention. I mean, we live in a world where reputable information sources are thin on the ground, and where an organisation like Full Fact has a vital role to play. And talking of social media as a breeding ground of misinformation and groundswells of public opinion, Zoe, you raised the topic of Amber Heard and Johnny Depp and their lawsuit, how that's playing out across social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know about you, but I can't go on Twitter without seeing Johnny Depp or Amber Heard trending at the moment, and you can watch their testimony live, and it just seems to be all over social media right now. The reason why I wanted to talk about this today is that it almost feels like there are two things going on at the same time. There's the actual court case, and then there's this trial by social media aspect as well, where if you go on to any social media platform now, there are people who are clearly team Amber Heard and supporting her, and then people who are team Johnny Depp. And it's interesting how the court case is obviously focused on the facts and the evidence, whereas this wider discussion on social media seems to be very much about which of these two parts of this celebrity former couple people are supporting. So it does make me think, as someone who used to be a lawyer a very long time ago, how this is really hard for the whole due process. And the way that is developed. And obviously there's things you could do as a judge in directing your jurors not to be involved on social media and only to look at certain things online. But nevertheless, when you've got almost like a tornado going on outside the courtroom in the form of these very, very difficult and often quite visceral discussions on social media, it does make you think about what we need to do and what judges and lawyers need to do as well in order to make sure that jurors and judges can make these decisions in unbiased, fair ways. I think it's very, very difficult.
Of course, it happens at the same time or in parallel to another big court case in the UK, which is the Colleen Rooney-Rebecca Vardy court case, which again started through social media, is being played out on social media, and very much the same. It usually, which side you come down on? Are you Vardy or are you Rooney? It's interesting as a football fan that I've just kind of tuned out of that one, but it's exactly the same. Every time I go on to Twitter, there's an enormous amount of discussion and debate, and it must make it really, really hard if you are involved in either of those cases to really separate yourself from it and not get sucked in.
Definitely. And it says something about the nature of public discourse now, that it's so hard to have a balanced, reasonable discussion about anything. It seems to be very much about picking a side, and that should be the last thing you do when you're really thinking through an issue, in my view.
Looking at things objectively, yeah, absolutely. And talking about objectively, another item you raised was the article you read, I think was it in the Sunday Times, about Winston Marshall, who not my favourite band in the world, but was the banjo player for Mumford and Sons a few years back. And I had to look it up and read it. I hadn't seen any of this, but he got cancelled, in inverted commas, online for sharing some views or recording some views that were not, or counter to the views perhaps of his bandmates.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting article in itself for what happens to someone after they get cancelled. Once all the social media dies down, what are you left with and what happens to your career? And as with the previous story about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, we'll pop the link to this and also that one in the show notes as well, so people can catch up with that. The Times one is behind a paywall, unfortunately, although it has been quite extensively covered in other places as well. So it's very interesting from the perspective of what happens after someone gets cancelled, but also how you really have to have a strong stomach to get involved in these social media debates. Anyone who's followed this story will know that absolutely he did tweet some views which seem to be very different to what the rest of his band would have said politically, and certainly led to him leaving the band as well. So there were pretty catastrophic consequences for his career. Really interesting reading the article as well about how actually when it came down to it, I'm not sure he necessarily approached this in the way that Piers Morgan would have approached it, as in, I am going out there and really taking a stand. It sounds like he actually tweeted the thing that got him cancelled almost in a very off-the-cuff moment, and is now living with the consequences of that. So really, really fascinating example, really interesting story of what happens, and does cancel culture even work?
Well, yeah, it was funny because when you sent this through, I was listening to Mark Commode and Simon Mayo at the weekend, as I would normally do, and they were talking about the very fact there's a film with Mark Wahlberg and Mel Gibson plays his dad, and they were talking about the very fact that Mel Gibson is still acting in films shows that cancel culture in Hollywood, at least, is it's there. But people are getting away with it, or people are getting away with something, or being forgiven. I don't know what it is, but being able to have a career beyond the incidents themselves. But Mel Gibson's fairly famously documented as being somebody that holds alternative views and is still out there making films. So yeah, I think that cancel culture question of does it exist, how does it represent itself? Who's doing the cancelling? Who's whiter than white here? All in a week where we're looking at the Elon Musk potentially not buying Twitter now because he's looked into the data and he can't tell how many accounts on Twitter are verified or how many are not verified. So the whole idea that these channels, these places where we spend all this time and we hold these views and share these opinions, are moderated, if you like, by an extreme set of values from people that shouldn't be in charge. But yeah, the long and the short of it, Zoe, to sum up, is that I still won't be listening to Mumford and Sons, even if he's not in the band.
Fair point. Yes, absolutely.
Anyway, now for our conversation with Laura Dewis.
We are very excited to welcome Laura Dewis to the podcast today. She is the Chief Operating Officer at Full Fact. Laura oversees the delivery of Full Fact strategy. She previously spent a decade leading digital transformation in government, delivering changes to working practices and merging teams to focus on data publishing. Prior to that, Laura worked in product and editorial roles at the Open University and the BBC, with a focus on open data and online learning. She worked briefly in research and development for McGraw-Hill in New York. Laura has served on advisory groups for the Cabinet Office, the United Nations Statistics Division, UNESCO, the OECD, the UK Regulators Network, and Harvard University. Laura, we are delighted to have you here today. Thank you so much for coming on Starts at the Top.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'd really like to start with a little bit of a hat tip to Danny Atias, because he did a really interesting introduction to himself when he joined your podcast. And so just to add to that little bit long biography, if you don't mind, I would like to just say that I am a 43-year-old female. I'm able-bodied. I'm white, straight, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm Welsh, and I went to a comprehensive school and was the first person in my family to go to university. So that's just a bit of personal background about me.
Oh, that's brilliant, Laura. Thank you. And thanks for sharing something of yourself with our listeners. And for anyone that hasn't come across Full Fact before, can you tell our listeners a bit more about what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. We are, in brief, a fact-checking charity. And so our job is to hold politicians and journalists to account for making incorrect claims. So, for example, at the moment, the Prime Minister has made an incorrect claim about employment 9 times, and we are trying to encourage that claim to be corrected on the record. So we have an enormous amount of campaigning work that we are doing, not just in terms of what's going on in things like the online safety bill, but actually what are the processes and systematic issues, particularly in government, that make it difficult for MPs to correct the claims that they make when they are wrong.
Can you tell us a bit more about how Full Fact does all of that amazing work behind the scenes? Because obviously digital is so fundamental to how you operate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's pretty frightening when you look at the numbers that we work with. So I would say around 100,000 claims are made in the UK every day. One of those claims per fact checker can be dealt with. So in total, when you look at like the global number of fact checks that have been published, if we look at that in terms of using claim review, which is a way of tagging fact checks, so other search engines can figure out which content online has been fact checked. If you look at their numbers, around 100 to 150,000 fact checks have been published globally, right, ever. So when you're looking at that kind of scale, it's really important that we're using digital and we're using technologies to be able to tackle the problems that we see out there. So Full Fact do that in several ways. We have policy and advocacy teams who are very much leading on things like campaigning around the online safety bill. We obviously have our fact-checking editorial team, so an amazing group of people who are constantly monitoring what's going on out there and checking those claims and providing the information that is needed to correct those claims, so the reality of what's going on in different subject areas. And we also have an amazing communications team who are working with our technology team often to develop solutions to the problems that we have. So there are a couple of really good examples where we have used digital at scale. I would say during the pandemic, our partnership with an organisation called Pregnant and Screwed was one of the really interesting ones. So this is where we were seeing vaccine hesitancy in people who are pregnant. So the take-up of the vaccine was tracking way behind the take-up in the general population. And Pregnant and Screwed were doing amazing work, but they only had so much capacity to be able to answer all of the questions that they were getting from the people that they were working with. So we partnered up with them and we used WhatsApp to allow people to ask us questions. And we would go out and investigate what was going on in that space and bring back the facts. And that was, so helpful to so many people and a really good example of how we could partner and use digital to make sure that we were both listening to people and understanding their concerns, being able to see how those concerns were trending, so where the kind of biggest worries were for people, and how we could then apply our resources to be able to fact check and make sure that good, solid, factual information got out there. And in that team, we had a qualified doctor. So we were very lucky to be able to work with an expert to do that work. So yeah, that's one example, I would say. The other that we talk about a lot is how we use artificial intelligence and particularly natural language processing. So as you can imagine, you've got a world of information out there. Most of us every day are completely overwhelmed, right, with information. And so how on earth do you get to figure out which is, where misinformation is happening, where disinformation is happening, and what are the most important problems to tackle? So we use technology that we are developing ourselves and with a global network of fact checkers around the world to help fact checkers do their job. So the idea is not to use artificial intelligence to replace fact checkers, but to make sure that the process of fact checking is as good as it possibly can be. There are probably 4 ways in which the technology can really help us. So one thing that technology does really well is find other similar things. So if a claim has been made that's incorrect and we've gone and corrected it, then it can go and find out where that claim has been used again and again and again. So while the source of that incorrect claim might have corrected it, obviously that information might have gone further and be published in multiple places. So can we use technology to identify all of those places that incorrect information has gone so that we can try to do something about it? The second is just identifying the right things to fact check. Right, because there's so much out there. So how can we kind of use the technology to scan what's out there using particular kind of rules that we give it for what we're interested in, and make sure that it brings back stuff that we can then look at quite quickly. And a big part of it is also like speeding up that process. So automating the way that we can access official sources of information. So one example of that would be ONS statistics that I used to be responsible for publishing. So how do we actually bring back those statistics in a way that's really useful for our teams to be able to quickly look at them and reference them in any fact check that they might be doing? And the final thing, I think, but really, really critically important, is we need to make every fact check work as hard as possible. And that means not just publishing it on our website, but thinking about where people access information and making sure that we correct it at the point at which they're accessing that information. So yes, we have a fantastic number of supporters, and they will be actively coming to our website, and they know us as they know a place to go, but we're not a destination for millions of people who are much more likely to be looking for information via a search engine. And so it's much more useful for us to be able to say this particular piece of information has been fact checked at the point in which they're searching for that information. And so hundreds of millions of people see our fact checks on other platforms, and that's a really critical piece of how we use technology.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that insight into how you work, because it's such an incredibly difficult, incredibly complex area, isn't it? And it's fascinating to hear how you're using technology, especially AI, to deal with all of this. I mean, it really is one of the great challenges of our times, isn't it? How we deal with misinformation and all the other attendant issues. Do you think that we as a society have kind of fully woken up to some of the implications of that? Because it strikes me as it's a bit like fighting a war, isn't it, in many ways?
Absolutely. And I would say, like the answer to lots of questions, a little bit yes and a little bit no. You know, we have the online safety bill at the moment being debated, and we don't think there's enough that's being said about misinformation and disinformation and the harms that can do, and how we need to address that as a society. So we are very much campaigning around that at the moment. So if you go to our website, for example, you will see that we are running a campaign about honesty in politics. We have had 23,000 people sign a petition in the last couple of weeks saying that they want to make sure that the systems in Parliament allow for MPs to correct the record. That's not actually the case in all cases. And so really kind of raising awareness about the issue here is really critical. And if society understood this and there was enough understanding, we wouldn't have to be in this space and doing this work. So no, I don't think there's enough understanding of that. Having said that, the fact that we have an online safety bill and it's being debated, right, is raising awareness of this. And certainly there are lots and lots of great organisations campaigning in this space.
I was just going to sort of riff off the idea that people are going to sort of different destinations to find information, and it starts usually with a Google search. And we, as a society, I think, have got quite used to trusting what we see on these platforms. So how are you working with the likes of Google, Twitter, and some of the social platforms to make sure that you're seen and fact checks are seen by everyone? Because, as I said, that page one of Google, taking it as scripture and then moving on is kind of part of our society, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there is a really amazing project that lots of different organisations have contributed to around something called claim review. So that is a way that fact checkers internationally can tag their fact checks. And that just means that the search engines are then able to automate the bringing back of that fact check in association with the original article. And so then when you go to the search results, it will display that and say this is false or this is true or something of that nature, depending on how it's been categorized. So I think that's a really, really important project that is supported, as I said, internationally. The other thing that we do is that we work with Facebook. So we look at a feed of things that have been reported to us from Facebook's own mechanisms for moderating content. And we are actively engaged in looking at that content and making decisions about whether it is something that, is in the public interest for us to do a fact check about. So that is part of our editorial process.
Just thinking, Zoe, you probably saw it too, but all those sort of parents WhatsApp groups throughout lockdown where somebody would say, somebody's got COVID within the school, and then it would suddenly flood across and everyone would be jumping on the bandwagon and talking about, vaccinations and things like that without doing the fact checks. So much of the discourse amongst humans is sort of done in that way, where it's the passing on of information. It has always been that way. Making it really, really easy for people to just say, well, hold on, let's go and check the facts and come back to the discussion. I'm fully armed with a better answer, because it can just explode.
I agree. And some of the parents' WhatsApp groups I'm in are absolutely the places where those things happen. I suppose that must be one of the hard parts of what you do at Full Fat, where you have those kind of hidden pockets of places where you've got misinformation spreading, but it must be really hard to see because it's of closed groups and those sorts of forums.
Yeah, absolutely. And so some of the work that we are looking at, and it's very early days at the moment, but is how do we work with very specific communities around this, communities that we know are being affected, but we might not always know exactly how until we're working much more closely with them. So that for us is about partnerships with other organisations like we did with Pregnant and Screwed, or it's, just working with those communities directly and really understanding exactly how they might be being targeted. And sometimes we also have our supporters in particular, and this is partly about the importance of raising awareness about the charity itself, is that our supporters, when they know we exist and what we do and they understand that, they contact us directly and they share things that otherwise we wouldn't see. So that might be emails that they're receiving from people that are in positions of power who are spreading misinformation through an email channel. And when you think about the impact of that in a situation such as an election, that can fundamentally impact on democracy in the UK. So yeah, having increased awareness of our charity and what we are doing and how we can help helps us to see some of that information flow that we might not otherwise.
Having worked in big corporate organisations, a lot of what you hear from leaders within those organisations is sort of taken as verbatim and fact without having the ability to always go back and check those facts. And we've seen the likes of, going back to big tech, Google and other organisations like that, where internally you'll suddenly start to see whistleblowers and people coming in saying, well, this is how information gets spread, or this is how things are shared within. It might be a step too far, but how easy is it to start to influence the flow of information and misinformation within organisations, not just what we see out in the public arena?
Yeah, incredibly challenging. And I guess that's why, those mechanisms are there, right, for whistleblowers. It's not really an area that we are focused on particularly, but I would recognise the challenge.
It's such brave and important and vital work that Full Fat are doing. And it reminds me of when one of my children, so my son, when he was about 6, he had a piece of homework where he had to go on the internet and find out facts about a certain topic. And then I remember him showing me the homework afterwards. And we talked about how actually we need to check that these things are right and they're true, because he'd found some quite outlandish things. And there's something about how humans just passively accept information, don't we, from these really sort of trusted sources. And I guess this happens offline as well, doesn't it? I mean, my mum will believe anything that she hears on an LBC phone-in, bless her.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my previous work, I worked for the pensions regulator, and you had a lot of people who were having scammers contact them around their pensions. They were often elderly and vulnerable, and perhaps not so kind of much in the digital world. So this is often happening, as we've just discussed, on the telephone or via letter, or even by people knocking on their doors. So that whole world of trying to avoid the harms that happen to people because of misinformation coming in all sorts of directions is so critical for us to be thinking about systematically. Full Fat can only do so much, and has a very particular focus, but yeah.
Absolutely. So to change tack a bit, when we spoke first a few weeks ago, we were talking about design, and this has obviously been an ongoing thread through your career and your work at the BBC. And I think it's a subject that kind of gets slightly inconsistent airtime in the charity sector and perhaps beyond as well. Can you tell us a bit more about your passion for design?
Absolutely. I think I've worked in too many organizations where design is just thought of as, how do you make something a particular color? And it's always at the end of a process. And so, a designer will be asked, here's some information, can you just stick it online, and can you make sure it looks good? And design is so much more than that. And having organizations who don't understand that get to a point where they understand just how critical design is just something that I'm so passionate about. Designers, of course, do make things look beautiful, but they also make them useful. But I would say even more important than making them useful, they help us make the decisions about whether we should be making something at all. And I think that's what's so critical about design is if you have designers working with you right from the very beginning of a process, they will help you address your assumptions. They will help you kind of cut through any biases that you might have, or that curse of knowledge that we all have, that we've built up experience and information and views and opinions over time, which may not hold true when you look at the problem from a different perspective. So designers are very good at helping everybody in a project to see things from a different perspective and to prototype and test things and get views from the actual people who might be using whatever it is that you're building, in order to really test whether we need this thing at all. And so I think that's really critical. And I would give a shout out to Jodie Bennett, who's an amazing designer working at the pensions regulator, who did a fantastic job of collaboratively working with the organisation and understanding how the organisation worked so that she could embed design processes into how everybody worked, rather than seeing design as a silo or design at the end of a process. And in that way, she really got buy-in from multiple people across the organisation to that design process being embedded in how they delivered product. And I thought that was an excellent piece of work. And it took the organisation right from that kind of space of, we need an app, but we don't know why we need it, to, okay, we need to engage in research before we even start to do anything, before we even think about colours. Like, that's not what design is all about. So I think that, for me, creativity is about being able to select the best idea from a range of what might be fantastic ideas, but really getting to the idea that is going to be the one that makes the difference for people, is the benefit of having designers in an organisation.
Totally, I completely agree with that. I think there's something about how designers often get pigeonholed, don't they, as just dealing with design. Well, obviously, as you say, that's important in itself. Whereas I think all the really good designers that I've worked with, and indeed the amazing people that you've mentioned there too, it's about understanding business problems, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about saying there is a phase here before we even kind of come up with a strategy of figuring out what the problem is, defining the problem really well, and listening to people outside our organizations who will be ultimately the end users of anything that we create. Too often, I think we learn so much in an organization that we think of ourselves as the experts in a domain subject, and we forget that, you know, if you're coming at what the organization delivers from outside, you're going to have a completely different set of knowledge and skills and understanding and assumptions about that organization and what it's there to do. And so I think just breaking that down and actually engaging people who are going to be using whatever services that you might be designing is really critical. And I think, you know, there is no more important time to do that when the people that you are serving are very, very different to you, you know, and remembering that you are not the user.
A few weeks ago, we talked about designing for disability, and I know that's a subject you feel really passionate about. So can you give people perhaps a bit of advice about how they should consider that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, when I did a master's in electronic publishing a long time ago, and it's quite a quaint name for a master's course now, but that really started to teach me about all the benefits and the opportunities that we can use the web for. And I was very, very committed to the idea of my career being about equalizing access to information online for everybody. And that included people with disabilities. And in fact, I saw some of the greatest opportunities for people with disabilities because the use of the internet opened up so much more access to information, tools, technologies that meant that people with disabilities were able to access things more quickly or even at all, right? So for me, that was really important. I was incredibly lucky to then get a job on BBC Ouch, which at the time was, I would say, kind of like a lifestyle magazine format online for people with disabilities, produced by people with disabilities. And it's still edited, it's a podcast now, it's still edited by the amazing Damon Rose, who I think is really interesting and says something about the time that when he was employed by the BBC, The Sun ran a front page about the BBC hiring a blind TV director, right? So that's kind of interesting in itself, right? And we've come, I hope, a long way since those days, but it kind of says a lot about, yeah, how disability was seen, right, at that time. Ouch do this brilliant editorial, so they're quite punchy. So if you look at their recent podcasts, they are about things like how you might test inaccessible sex toys. They've also recently met the first disabled crew to fly in zero gravity. So it's really, really interesting content that they are producing. And through working on that website, I got to meet lots of colleagues who had disabilities. And it really showed me and taught me about the differences between different disabilities and the nuances of design for people with different disabilities. So it kind of feels obvious to me now, but back then it was really eye-opening about if you design for one particular disability, you can really make things difficult for somebody with a different disability. So how do we look at this and really understand it? And it's complicated and it's hard, but it's really important. And how to test with people with disabilities, because I was really lucky that I was working in an enormous organization at the time. So there was a lot of staff around that I could kind of test with and see how things worked or didn't work for them. So that was incredibly important. I then went from that job into other organizations where I would be sat around the table with people who would say, well, I know that legally we need to design for people with disabilities, but actually maybe we just take the fine, you know, because it's really difficult. And actually, how many people really have a disability who are using our website? And so part of my role then was about trying to shift people's points of view about that. And part of that is just data, you know, just how many people have a disability. Part of it is kind of trying to help people empathize. And so, you know, pointing out that any of us could be disabled at any point in our lives, and we could also be temporarily disabled. So I might wake up tomorrow and have an eye infection and not be able to see as well as I can today. And so, you know, what could I do to make sure that I could still continue to work in that situation? So some of it was about building empathy and understanding, and having people think about their own situations and how it might impact them. And also just getting across the point that often when we design for people with disabilities, we're making things better for everybody. And so again, kind of appealing, I suppose, to people's selfish side to a degree, but we are all selfish human beings. And I think, using examples like if you have a ramp up into a building that's been put there for wheelchair users, how often do you use that? Simply because you might be, I don't know, maneuvering a bike, or you might be wearing high heels and it's easier than worrying about tripping up the stairs. So all of these things that we design for, when we make them really easy to use, we can make them easy to use for everybody and everyone benefits.
I did some work with RNIB last year, and one of the things I really liked about their content and what they put out is that they try and help all readers of their content to step into a blind or partially sighted person's shoes every once in a while. And I really like the stuff they do about communicating through social media, for example, and how the use of emojis and how the use of untagged images and things like that can really impact into a user's life. And I've noticed a bit of a shift actually in many people starting to use, and the visibility of things like alt tags and images on social media, particularly Twitter, not necessarily as a result of it, but I just really admired what they did. The other thing that we were discussing before we came on was how to achieve digital at scale. Now, you've worked within digital change at scale. You've worked in many different organisations, and I imagine, like most of us in digital teams, small teams to impact a big issue. Full Fact have 35 people, and you're trying to take on the world. So how can leaders play a more active role in helping their digital teams to achieve that greater impact, do you think?
Yeah. And I think, achieving impact is always more than digital. So it's about recognizing where digital kind of interfaces with other activities that are going on. So I would say at Full Fact, it's a small team, but it's a team that pull together and that work across disciplines. And so, for example, with the Honesty in Politics campaign, that is very much as what we're doing in terms of meeting people, advocating, having conversations in real life, as much as it is about how we're using digital to, say, build the petition and make sure that we have the ability for people to share their views and their information with us in a way that we can then use in our campaigning. So I think there's a variety of ways that you can do this at scale. I would say it's very different, and I'm only 4 months into working in the charity sector and at Full Fact, but it's very different working in a small organisation to some of the larger organisations that I've worked in. And so in some of my previous work, when we're talking about digital at scale, part of that is really about how do you shift the organisation, right, from being potentially an organisation that is very IT focused to one that truly understands what digital means. And if you're going to do anything at scale, even with all of the resources that large organisations have, it's very difficult to do that unless you have that understanding right at the heart of the organisation, certainly supported by the senior team, but understood throughout. And I think that that's been a real challenge at times in the organisations I've worked in, to be able to make that shift from understanding deeply what IT is to understanding what digital is and understanding how those two disciplines work together effectively.
Yeah, just thinking about some of the smaller conversations I've had about bringing those teams together, bringing those disciplines together and seeing the interactions at the table is half of the joy. And I think our jobs, so that's what I enjoy the most, is when you bring those people together, and often in situations where they're not even talking to each other for the first time, or maybe meeting each other for the first time, or at least being asked, how do you see this? And I think that's where some of the magic can happen.
Yeah, that's exactly the experience I had in an organisation where I went in as the kind of most senior person in digital, and I immediately want to meet my technology colleagues. And in my handover note, I'm thinking, where are the contacts? Who is it that I'm supposed to be speaking to? And they weren't in my handover note. So when I kind of dug them out, I said, can we have a coffee? I said, oh, I've just taken on the role from the predecessor. And they were like, who is that? We've never met.
Who was the predecessor?
Yeah. And yeah, I had come from an organization actually where very luckily I had colleagues in IT, data, enterprise architecture, and myself who really understood each other's disciplines enough to be able to work really effectively together. So I've seen teams where it works beautifully well, and then organizations where it's like, this is completely new, and why would I speak to you, and what are you here to do? And you really have to start kind of from scratch. And I think that often digital can be seen as, the cowboys of the organization. I think, it's this sense of, they have this thing called agile, and it just means that they rush everything and do things quickly, and they never write anything down, and, because they just hate bureaucracy. And, like digital can be seen a bit like designers can have this kind of brand image problem of being seen as fluffy and all about kind of just, making things pink. That does the digital have this kind of reputation of being cowboys and not really doing anything properly. And then IT can get this kind of brand image problem of being laggards, or a bit computer says no. And actually the reality is never that. It's just that these perceptions kind of develop because people aren't talking to each other and not understanding each other's disciplines. And so inevitably distrust, is bred in an organization, particularly with something like digital, which still feels quite new, to lots of organizations. The definition of digital is not well understood. And so it does feel like a bit of a mystery, or, something that needs to be rejected sometimes from the organization. And I just think that there are very clear differences between what a technology department was set up to do and what a digital kind of era needs. And so actually understanding that and having that conversation really openly in organizations is really important, because IT departments do an enormously important job, but their incentives for what they do are very, very different. So if you think about an IT department, they are focused on a controlled environment. They want to keep change requests to a minimum, because, if you make a change to technology in an organization, there is a process change cost. There is a cost to people's learning curve and therefore productivity. And they need to keep costs to a minimum and manage that. And they are building things for a group of people who are known to them, who are working on a very fixed technology stack, and everything's kind of within their control to a degree. And then you have digital, where you're designing stuff for people you've probably never met. You might know a little bit about them, but, probably even less now than you used to be able to know through analytics. They are on multiple browsers and devices. And what is the norm for them is not set by an organization, it's set by the world and innovators in the world who are doing new things and setting new precedents. So, when I think about Tom Loosemore's definition of digital, the thing that most sticks out for me in that definition is you are having to think about people's raised expectations, because you are not in control of those expectations. And those expectations are not being set by you as an organization, they're being set by what's going on outside. And so being able to talk to IT colleagues and also procurement colleagues who are potentially bringing in, technology suppliers into the organization about what does it mean to be a digital organization, and how does that change how you see the IT function and how you see the digital function and how you bring in IT suppliers and work with them. All of that needs to be openly discussed. Otherwise, you're just going to be banging your head against a brick wall for a long time.
Yeah, there's my sort of experience that there's, with IT teams in particular, there's always a low expectation across the organisation of what they do. And I think what I was really interested in the relationship I built up in my last role was the relationship between me and the CIO. I think was one of I really respected the way that he set up everything to protect the business. It was all about protection. It was all about being in control. And I guess the way that we helped each other was I helped him to sort of think about the boundaries of how far can we push that, how far can we push that safety, what can we do to do that, and how can we achieve it. And when they make those first steps into, for me, it was implementing a system which was actually the first cloud-based system within that organization. The releasing of data beyond the four walls of the organization, beyond the firewall, was the bit that unlocked all of that for that CIO. And since that point, I think the role of the IT team within that organization has just grown and grown and grown, because they've let go of a bit of control, probably instigated by somebody that's just come in and said, well, how can we push this barrier just that little bit?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall as you were having those conversations.
Yeah, well, I think that's the crux of it. I think for us as consultants going into organisations, but I think that the thing that I think you sort of brought across is that that excitement, the excitement of being at that table, the excitement that those teams are probably, IT teams don't want to be known as the sort of the boring laggards within organisations. They have ambitions, they want to do things as well. And the bit that I love the most about the role that I do is just plugging in and just seeing the little diodes of excitement going off in people's faces, where you go, I can actually do this. Yeah, you can. And it just takes a little bit of confidence and a little bit of a step outside of the comfort zone to do it. But that's the favorite bit, is bringing those people to the table, because those conversations just aren't happening all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in that, there can be a sense sometimes in the organization that the investment is all going into digital, and the people who've worked in IT who've often seen like the opportunity of digital and wanted to kind of see the organization progress, but they're not getting any of those resources. And so it's also about saying, well, how do we actually work together for the good of the organization to make sure we've got the right resource in the right place, and that we understand who's got the right skills to do the various things that we need to do as an organization.
I think that's a nice note to finish on. So thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was fantastic.
So thank you very much to Laura for joining us on Starts at the Top. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. If there's anything that you want to share or respond to, please do let us know.
As usual, please do send us your feedback. If you use a podcast app where you can rate and review, that would be wonderful. It does help people find Starts at the Top. You can also share your plans, ideas, or questions with us on Twitter. We're at StartsAtTheTop1, and you can email us at startsatthetoppodcast@gmail.com.
We'll be back with another episode next week, so we'll see you then.
See you then.